The fundamental facts that undergird the inference to Jesus' resurrection are actually accepted by the wide majority of New Testament historians who have written on Jesus of Nazareth. And these would be primarily three in number. First would be the discovery of his empty tomb by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. Secondly would be the post-mortem appearances of Jesus alive to various individuals and groups. And then thirdly would be the very origin of the disciples' belief that God raised him from the dead. Those three facts have been firmly established by historical studies about the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And so the question is, how do you best explain these? And I would argue that there is no explanation of those three facts which is better than the one that the original disciples themselves gave, namely, God raised him from the dead. And if God raised Jesus from the dead, that's highly significant because it's not just any old John Doe that's been raised from the dead. It is Jesus of Nazareth who, by his radical personal claims, put himself in the very place of God. If those claims have been vindicated publicly and dramatically by God himself, then Jesus was not the blasphemer that the Jewish authorities claimed he was. Rather, he was who he claimed to be, the Son of God, come for our salvation.
What is the challenge for people who do believe in this Jesus to be able to defend the gospel well? How do you do that well?
St. Anselm had a motto, faith seeking understanding. The Christian faith is not a brain-dead faith. It is a living, inquiring faith. And so viewers who are already Christians should be intellectually alive and alert to exploring this faith in all its profundity. And that will involve learning to defend what we believe as well as to explain what we believe. 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give a defense for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. And so I would encourage folks to memorize a few arguments for God's existence, to memorize those three facts that undergird the resurrection of Jesus, and be prepared to share those with an unbeliever if they should be invited to. And the best way to do this, I personally think, is to get a book like the book I wrote, On Guard, which is a kind of manual for equipping Christians to give such a positive defense of the Christian faith.
What do you think is the convincing argument for the existence of God?
I've defended about 5 different arguments for God's existence. I think one of the powerful things about the God hypothesis is that it explains such a wide range of human experience. So I think, for example, that God is the best explanation of why anything at all exists rather than nothing. I think God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe at a time in the finite past. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe for the existence of embodied conscious agents like ourselves. God is the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties in the world. And finally, I would argue that the very possibility of God's existence implies that God exists. So for all of those different reasons, I think that the hypothesis that God exists is very plausible and more plausible than it's contradictory.
Many people will say, though, that I'm a good person, I don't believe in God. What would you say to them?
That question is related to the moral argument, which goes like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Without God, everything becomes relative. But number 2, objective moral values and duties do exist, from which it follows, therefore, God exists. Now, when people insist, but I am a good person without God, all they're doing is providing evidence for that second premise, that objective moral values and duties do exist. What we want to know is, what is the foundation or the ground for those objective moral values and duties that we all sense and try to live by.
Because you're right. I mean, when we look at, our society looks at things as black and white. So, we'll see somebody killing somebody and we would say that's wrong. But you're saying, what is the moral basis for this? How do we determine what's wrong and what's right?
That's exactly right. Although we may differ on many questions of secondary significance, when it comes to very basic moral questions like the intrinsic value of human beings, we recognize that there is an objectivity to moral value and duty that is imposed upon us. And the question is, where do these things come from on an atheistic worldview? They seem to be foundationless.
You've dedicated most of your life to defending the gospel and teaching people about the existence of God. Tell me about your story of faith. How did you come to know Jesus?
Well, I wasn't raised in a church-going family. My parents were nominal members of the United Methodist Church, but this was not a part of our lives on any sort of regular or serious basis. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask what I call the big questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? What's the meaning of my existence? And in the search for answers, I began to attend church. The only problem was, instead of answers, what I found was a sort of social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate, and the other high school students who pretended to be such good Christians on Sunday lived for their real God the rest of the week, which was popularity. And this really bothered me because externally, at least, I was leading a better life than they were, and yet deep down inside, I knew how spiritually empty I was. And I thought, they must be just as empty as I am, but they're putting up a false front, pretending to be something they're not. They're all just a pack of hypocrites. And so I began to grow very resentful toward the institutional church because of the hypocrisy and the phoniness that I saw there. And soon this attitude spread toward people in general. Everybody, I thought, is a hypocrite. Everyone is holding up a plastic mask to the world, while the real person is cowering down inside, afraid to come out and be real. And so I was on my way, frankly, toward becoming a very alienated young man who wanted nothing to do with other people and just threw myself into my studies and my books in order to avoid contact with them.
And so then what happened?
What happened was one day that I was feeling particularly miserable, I walked into my high school German class and I sat down behind a girl who is one of these types that is always so happy.
Oh, yes.
It just makes you sick. And I tapped her on the shoulder and she turned around and I said, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, it's because I know Jesus Christ is my personal Savior. And I was absolutely floored. I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him living in your heart. And I said, well, what would he want to do a thing like that for? And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was so filled with bitterness and anger inside. And she said there was someone who really loved me. And who was it but the God of the universe? And that thought staggered me. I just couldn't take it in, to think that the God of the universe could love me, Bill Craig, that worm down there on that speck of dust called planet Earth. It was just unbelievable. Well, I went home that night and began to read the New Testament. I had been given a copy in the 5th grade by the Gideons when they visited our grade school. I'd never read it. And as I began to read the New Testament, I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And I realized then that I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that whatever I might have thought about those who claimed to be his followers in that local church I was attending, I couldn't deny him, because there was an authenticity and truth about his person and words that was just undeniable. So after about 6 months of the most intense soul searching that I've ever been through, I just came to the end of my rope one night and cried out to God And I cried out all the anger and bitterness that was in me, and surrendered my life to Christ to serve Him wholly for the rest of my earthly existence. And that marked the transformation in my life as a teenage boy of 16 years old, and I've never looked back.
Wow. Dr. Craig, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. It's been good to be with you.